She refused to move, but had no idea who she was up against. Would you give up your seat just to avoid a conflict? Naomi Carter never expected that a routine flight would turn into a battle for respect and dignity. She had booked her seat weeks in advance, 14C, an aisle seat with extra legroom, perfect for a busy executive preparing for one of the biggest pitches of her career. But then came the demand. A woman, draped in quiet entitlement, stood over Naomi's seat with her young daughter beside her. "You'll need to move," she said. "My child needs the window." Naomi calmly refused. That's when the tension in the cabin thickened. Passengers turned their heads. The mother's voice rose. A flight attendant was called. And just when Naomi thought she was standing her ground, the real shock came later. Because the woman on the plane wasn't just any frustrated passenger. She was a powerful executive at the very company Naomi was about to pitch to. What happens when personal conflict collides with professional ambition? When power dynamics shift and past grievances come roaring back at the worst possible moment? This is a story of resilience, corporate politics, and an unexpected twist that will leave you speechless. Stay until the end. You won't believe how it all unfolds. Like, comment, and subscribe if you've ever faced a moment where you had to choose between standing your ground or avoiding conflict. Would you have done what Naomi did? Let us know below. Naomi Carter stepped onto the airplane, adjusting the strap of her leather carry-on as she moved down the narrow aisle. She had spent the past few days preparing for her biggest career opportunity yet, and now all she wanted was a quiet, comfortable flight to Chicago. As a frequent traveler, she had learned the value of choosing her seat wisely. 14C, a premium aisle seat with extra legroom, was a small luxury she had booked well in advance. As she reached her row, she let out a small sigh of relief. No complications. No last-minute seat changes. Just a peaceful flight where she could review her notes and maybe even close her eyes for a bit. Or so she thought. Just as she was placing her laptop bag under the seat, a sharp voice cut through the hum of boarding passengers. "Excuse me, you're in the wrong seat." Naomi turned, already knowing from the tone that this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Standing before her was a blonde woman in her mid-40s, designer sunglasses perched atop her head as if she were still strolling through the airport duty-free shops. Beside her stood a young girl, about 8 or 9 years old, clutching the straps of her pink backpack. Naomi's brows knitted together in confusion. "No, this is my seat, 14C, she said evenly, pulling out her boarding pass as proof. The woman, whose name tag on her designer tote read Jessica Reynolds, sighed dramatically. "My daughter needs the window seat. She gets anxious on flights," Jessica announced, placing a possessive hand on the child's shoulder. The girl said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor, her fingers nervously picking at the hem of her sweater. Naomi's heart softened for the child, but this wasn't about her. It was about the woman towering over her, acting as if her needs were more important than anyone else's. "I'm sorry to hear that," Naomi replied, keeping her voice calm, "but I specifically booked this seat. I need the legroom." Jessica's eyes flickered over Naomi, her navy blue business suit, her neat braids, her professional, polished presence. Naomi recognized that look. The quick assessment. The silent dismissal. Jessica leaned in, lowering her voice just enough to sound polite but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It's just a seat. Surely you understand that a child's needs come first." A few people in nearby rows glanced up from their phones, sensing the tension. Naomi inhaled slowly, gripping the armrest. She had been in situations like this before, where she was expected to give up her space, her comfort, her rights, because someone else decided she should. Her mind flashed to the long nights she spent preparing for her presentation, the months of work that led to this opportunity. She needed this time to focus. She wasn't moving. "Ma'am," Naomi said firmly, meeting Jessica's eyes, "this is my assigned seat. I won't be giving it up." Jessica's face flushed. "I need to speak to a flight attendant." Naomi didn't flinch. "Be my guest." Naomi sat still, her hands resting on the armrests of her seat, her heart beating a little faster now. She had been in uncomfortable situations before, but something about this felt different. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about expectation, the unspoken demand that she should give in simply because someone else wanted her to. Jessica huffed dramatically, flipping her sunglasses down over her eyes even though they were inside the airplane. "I don't understand why this is such a big deal," she said, shaking her head. "You're an adult. She's just a child." Naomi inhaled deeply. "And I booked this seat, just like you booked yours." Jessica let out a sharp laugh, turning slightly as if trying to gather support from the other passengers around them. Some people were pretending not to listen, eyes glued to their phones. Others, including an older man across the aisle, were watching with interest but saying nothing. "I just don't see why this has to be so difficult," Jessica continued, her voice rising. "I'm only asking for a little kindness." Naomi felt the weight of those words. It wasn't a request, it was an accusation. A setup. If she refused, she was the villain. Cold. Unfeeling. Difficult. She glanced at the little girl, who still hadn't spoken a word, her small hands gripping the straps of her pink backpack. Naomi felt for her, this wasn't her fault. But Jessica? Jessica was a different story. "Ma'am," Naomi said again, her voice steady, "I understand that you want your daughter to have the window seat. But I also have my own needs. I chose this seat for a reason, and I'm not moving." Jessica's mouth tightened. She bent down slightly, lowering her voice as though she were offering a secret. "Listen," she said, "you don't really need this seat, do you? I mean, look at you. You seem fit enough." Naomi stiffened. There it was. The assumption. The implication that she didn't deserve the space she had claimed. That her comfort was less important. A flicker of memories passed through her mind, being overlooked in meetings, spoken over in boardrooms, expected to accommodate others even when it came at her own expense. She met Jessica's gaze and smiled. "Not this time. I paid for this seat," Naomi said firmly, "just like you paid for yours." "My answer is no." Jessica's face darkened. Her fingers gripped the seat back tightly. "You're really going to do this?" she snapped. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "I'm not doing anything. I'm sitting in my assigned seat." Jessica's breath came out in an irritated huff. "Unbelievable," she muttered, turning on her heel. "I'm getting the flight attendant." As Jessica stormed toward the front of the plane, Naomi glanced over at the older man across the aisle. He gave her a small, knowing smile. And the slight, silent nod of a man who had seen this kind of thing before. Naomi exhaled slowly, gripping the armrests of her seat as Jessica marched toward the front of the plane. A tense hush had settled over the surrounding passengers, the kind of silence that comes when people sense trouble but don't want to get involved. She glanced around, feeling the weight of curious eyes on her. Some people stole quick glances, while others openly watched. The older man across the aisle gave her another small nod, his expression understanding, but he didn't speak. Naomi wasn't sure what Jessica planned to do, but she had a feeling it wasn't over. Less than a minute later, Jessica returned, triumphant, with a flight attendant in tow. Sophia, a young woman with a neat ponytail and a warm but professional expression, approached the row. Her badge glinted under the cabin lights as she stopped beside Naomi's seat. "Hi there," Sophia said in a friendly tone. "I understand there's a concern about seating?" Before Naomi could answer, Jessica jumped in. "Yes. My daughter needs the window seat for her anxiety, but this lady refuses to move." Naomi kept her face neutral, though the words made her stomach tighten. "This lady?" Sophia nodded, glancing down at her tablet. "Let me check your seat assignments." She tapped the screen a few times before looking up. "Ms. Reynolds, you and your daughter are assigned to row 22, seats A and B." Jessica waved her hand impatiently. "Yes, but those seats don't recline properly, and my daughter needs the window." Surely she motioned at Naomi, can be flexible. Sophia's expression didn't change. Miss Carter is correctly seated in 14C, which she reserved. I'm afraid we can't ask another passenger to give up their seat unless they volunteer. Naomi felt a wave of relief. Jessica, however, wasn't done. Her voice rose. So you're saying you won't accommodate a child? What kind of airline is this? Sophia's pleasant smile never wavered. Ms. Reynolds, all passengers are expected to remain in their assigned seats. I'd be happy to help you find 2 seats together elsewhere on the plane. Jessica opened her mouth, then shut it. Her face turned an angry shade of pink. Fine. We'll remember this experience when booking in the future. With that, she grabbed her daughter's hand and stomped toward the back of the plane. Naomi finally let out a breath. Sophia turned to her, offering a small, reassuring smile. I apologize for the disturbance, Ms. Carter. Can I get you anything before takeoff? Naomi smiled back. No, thank you. I appreciate your help. Justice had been served. Naomi let out a slow breath as Jessica stormed toward the back of the plane, her daughter trailing behind her. The tension in her shoulders eased, but her heart was still pounding. She wasn't sure what had been worse, Jessica's entitlement, the public scrutiny, or the unspoken expectation that she should have just given in. The flight attendant, Sophia, lingered for a moment, offering a small, knowing smile. I see this more often than you'd think, she said softly. Some people believe their wants matter more than everyone else's needs. Naomi gave a tight smile. I've seen it too. Sophia nodded. Well, you handled yourself with class. If you need anything, just let me know. With that, she moved on, and Naomi finally let herself relax against the seat. She could still feel the silent energy around her. The cabin had gone back to normal, passengers adjusting their bags, scrolling on their phones, chatting with their seatmates, but there was a subtle shift in the air. She glanced across the aisle. The older gentleman who had watched everything gave her another nod, this time with something like approval. Naomi returned the nod. It was a quiet moment of understanding, a small but meaningful acknowledgement that what had just happened wasn't right, but that, this time, justice had prevailed. She turned back to her laptop, flipping open the screen. Her presentation for tomorrow's meeting filled the display, a strategy on diversity, inclusion, and equitable treatment in corporate spaces. She almost laughed at the irony. The very issues she was set to discuss in a boardroom tomorrow had just played out in real time, right here, in a cramped airplane cabin. Power. Assumptions. Entitlement. The expectation that some people should just adjust for the comfort of others. And yet, this time, things had gone differently. This time, she had stood firm, and someone in authority had upheld her right to do so. A quiet sense of victory settled over her. Naomi reached for the armrest and leaned back slightly as the pilot announced their upcoming departure. She had won this round. And she had a feeling this was only the beginning. The airplane landed with a smooth but firm jolt, the hum of the engines slowing as they taxied toward the gate. Naomi exhaled, finally releasing the last bit of tension from the flight. The confrontation with Jessica had been exhausting, but she had won. Now, it was time to shift her focus back to why she was here in the first place, the biggest business pitch of her career. As she stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal at O'Hare International Airport, the cool blast of air conditioning was a welcome contrast to the crowded jetway. The airport was alive with movement, business travelers in tailored suits briskly walking toward baggage claim, families navigating their way to connecting flights, and the occasional weary traveler slumped in a seat, sipping coffee from a paper cup. Naomi adjusted the strap of her carry-on bag and made her way toward the exit. She had been to Chicago before, but this trip felt different. There was more at stake. Sterling Financial had been a client she'd been courting for months. A powerhouse in the financial sector, they were finally ready to implement a diversity and inclusion strategy, and Naomi's firm was in the running to lead the initiative. If she nailed this pitch, it wouldn't just mean a lucrative contract, it would be a career-defining moment. Outside, the early afternoon breeze carried the crisp scent of the city, a mix of roasted coffee, faint exhaust fumes, and the metallic tang of skyscrapers reflecting the sun. She pulled her coat a little tighter around her shoulders as she stepped into a waiting rideshare, giving the driver the name of her hotel downtown. As the car weaved through traffic, Naomi took in the majestic Chicago skyline. Towering glass buildings reflected the bright blue sky, and the streets below bustled with movement. She spotted the Chicago River, its waters glinting in the sunlight, and the grand iron bridges arching over it, carrying pedestrians and vehicles alike. She took a deep breath, letting the city's energy settle into her. This was where it would all happen. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the view. A message from her assistant back in Philadelphia. "Your meeting is confirmed for 10 a.m. tomorrow. Conference room, Sterling Tower, 47th floor. Good luck, you got this." Naomi smiled to herself. Yes, she did. Tomorrow, she would walk into that boardroom and prove she was the right person for the job. But tonight, she would prepare, get a good meal, and rest. Because the moment she stepped into Sterling Financial, she needed to be at the top of her game. The next morning, Naomi walked into Sterling Financial's headquarters, a towering glass and steel structure that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The revolving doors whisked her into a marble-floored lobby, sleek and modern, with a high ceiling that echoed with the hushed conversations of professionals hurrying to their destinations. She checked in at the reception desk, smoothing the front of her navy blazer as she waited. This was it, the opportunity she had spent months preparing for. If she secured this contract, it wouldn't just be another win for her consulting firm, it would be the kind of partnership that could reshape corporate culture from the inside out. A young receptionist smiled and motioned toward the elevators. "You're expected in the Beacon Room on the 47th floor. Let me escort you." Naomi stepped inside the sleek elevator, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. This was where everything she had worked for would either take off or stall. When the doors slid open, she walked into a spacious conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Around the large oval table, several executives were already seated, reviewing notes and murmuring in low voices. She was met with a warm smile from William Donovan, the CEO, and a firm handshake from Madeline Brooks, the COO. But then, her stomach dropped. Seated near the head of the table, flipping through a leather-bound notebook, was Jessica Reynolds. Jessica. From the plane. Jessica, who had tried to bully her out of her seat less than 24 hours ago. Jessica, whose face now carried a perfectly polished professional smile, as if she hadn't caused a scene at 30,000 feet. Naomi forced her expression to remain neutral, but inside, her mind raced. Jessica is the head of talent acquisition. She wasn't just an attendee, she was a key decision maker. For a moment, their eyes met. A flicker of recognition, surprise, and something else, maybe irritation, flashed across Jessica's face. But in an instant, it was gone. With a polite, corporate perfect nod, Jessica extended a hand. "Ms. Carter. What a surprise. Welcome to Sterling Financial." For a brief moment, Naomi felt frozen in place. Jessica Reynolds. The same entitled woman from the plane, the one who had tried to publicly shame her for not giving up her seat, was now sitting across from her as a key executive at Sterling Financial. The absurdity of it all nearly made her laugh. But Naomi was a professional. She wasn't going to let this rattle her. She squared her shoulders, extended her hand, and matched Jessica's cool, corporate smile. "Ms. Reynolds. It is, indeed, a small world." Jessica's handshake was brief and firm, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of calculation, a hint of discomfort. Naomi knew exactly what was happening. Jessica had spent the previous day dismissing her as an inconvenience, treating her as if she were unimportant. And now? She was realizing just how wrong she had been. The room settled as introductions continued, but Naomi could still feel Jessica's gaze on her. Was she embarrassed? Annoyed? Worried that Naomi might bring up their flight encounter? It didn't matter. What mattered was that Jessica now had influence over the decision Naomi was here to win. As Naomi took her seat and opened her laptop, she reminded herself of one simple truth. This was business, and she wasn't here to lose. Naomi took a steady breath, her hands resting lightly on the polished conference table. The executives at Sterling Financial sat around her, waiting. Some leaned forward with quiet interest, while others, like Jessica Reynolds, remained stiff, their expressions unreadable. The moment had arrived. She clicked her laptop, and the first slide of her presentation appeared on the sleek screen at the front of the room. "Thank you all for your time today," she began, her voice warm but steady. "I know how valuable it is, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss an initiative that could be transformative for Sterling Financial." She let the words settle for a moment before continuing. "Diversity and inclusion aren't just about hiring, it's about retention, engagement, and creating a workplace culture that brings out the best in all employees. It's about making sure the talent you bring in doesn't walk out the door because they don't see a future here." She clicked to the next slide, revealing a set of industry statistics that painted a clear picture. Companies with strong diversity and inclusion programs saw higher innovation, better financial performance, and significantly lower turnover rates. Naomi let the numbers speak for themselves. She had long since learned that when presenting to executives, data mattered, but clarity mattered more. Across the table, William Donovan, the CEO, nodded slightly, his fingers steepled in thought. That was a good sign. Next to him, Madeline Brooks, the COO, leaned forward with interest. "I find this compelling," Madeline said. "We've had challenges with mid-career retention, especially among women and minority employees. How does your approach specifically address that?" Naomi welcomed the question. She had prepared for it. Mid-career retention often fails because employees don't see a path forward, she explained. "My initiative includes structured mentorship programs where high-potential employees are paired with senior executives, ensuring they receive guidance, visibility, and leadership development. We also focus on transparency in promotions. It's not enough to say leadership positions are available, we need to show employees exactly how they can get there, what's expected of them, and ensure fair evaluation processes." William nodded again, jotting something in his notebook. Naomi could feel the momentum shifting in her favor. Then, Jessica spoke. "This all sounds good in theory," she said smoothly, her hands folded on the table, "but I'm wondering how we implement this without disrupting our existing operations." Naomi had been expecting this. She knew Jessica wasn't just asking a question, she was testing her, looking for weak spots, trying to throw her off balance. She didn't flinch. "That's a great question, Ms. Reynolds," Naomi said, keeping her tone firm but professional. "The goal isn't to create disruption. It's to integrate these strategies into Sterling's existing structures seamlessly. That's why we start with small, measurable pilots, targeted mentorship programs in key departments, leadership training workshops, and structured feedback systems. Once we track success, we scale. No disruption. Just steady, strategic progress." For a brief moment, the room was silent. Then, William leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "I like it. Keep going." Naomi allowed herself a small smile. She wasn't done yet, but she had their attention. And that was the first step toward winning. Naomi clicked to the next slide, glancing around the table. The energy in the room had shifted. She could feel it. The numbers, the strategies, everything was landing exactly as she had hoped. William Donovan, the CEO, tapped his pen against the conference table, nodding slightly. He had the air of a man who had been convinced but wasn't quite ready to say so. Beside him, Madeline Brooks, the COO, leaned forward, her hands clasped in front of her as if she were already calculating how to implement Naomi's ideas. Naomi paused for a beat, allowing them time to process before she continued. "The truth is, Companies that embrace inclusion don't just improve employee satisfaction, they see stronger business results. When employees feel valued, they perform better, stay longer, and contribute more meaningfully to company goals. This isn't just a feel-good initiative, it's a competitive advantage. William let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as he looked down at his notes. "You make a strong case," he admitted, finally meeting her gaze. "I'll be honest, when we started talking about a diversity initiative, I was skeptical. A lot of companies throw money at these programs and see little change. But what you're describing, it's measurable. It's practical." Naomi smiled. "That's exactly the point. Too many initiatives focus on surface-level changes, statements, workshops, hiring quotas. But real change happens when organizations shift their structure. That's what makes this work." Across the table, Madeline nodded. "I like that you're focusing on mentorship and retention. Hiring is easy. Keeping talent engaged, that's where we struggle." Frederick Harris, a board member who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "I've been saying this for years," he said, his deep voice carrying through the room. "We bring in young talent from diverse backgrounds, but we don't show them how to rise in the company. I sit on multiple corporate boards, and I see the same thing everywhere: mid-career drop-off. Employees don't leave because they're unqualified. They leave because they don't see a future." Naomi nodded. "Exactly. And fixing that doesn't just help diverse employees, it helps everyone. When companies create clear pathways for leadership, they build stronger teams overall." Frederick leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "If we had implemented something like this 5, even 10 years ago, I wonder how much talent we would have retained." William nodded, seemingly lost in thought for a moment before speaking again. "So, Naomi, if we were to move forward with this, what would your first steps be?" Naomi sat up a little straighter, keeping her excitement in check. "First, I'd conduct an internal audit, confidential listening sessions with employees to understand what's working and what's not. That gives us a clear roadmap for implementation. Then, we'd launch pilot mentorship programs in select departments, with leadership accountability from day one. This allows us to measure impact before full-scale integration." Madeline exchanged a glance with William, then turned back to Naomi. "I have to say, I'm impressed. You're not just offering ideas, you're offering a plan." Naomi smiled. "That's what I do." The room was quiet for a moment. Then William leaned back and let out a slow breath. "I have to admit, this is one of the best proposals I've heard in a long time." Naomi allowed herself a small moment of victory. But just as she was about to move on, she noticed Jessica Reynolds shifting in her seat. Her expression was unreadable, but Naomi could sense the tension. Jessica wasn't nearly as convinced as the others. And Naomi knew she wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Naomi could feel the shift in the room. William, Madeline, and Frederick were all engaged, nodding at key points, asking thoughtful questions. She was making progress. But then, she caught the subtle but unmistakable movement from across the table, Jessica Reynolds, leaning back slightly in her chair, arms crossed, a polite but unreadable expression settling over her face. Naomi knew that look. Jessica was preparing to push back. "I think these are all interesting ideas," Jessica said smoothly, her voice even. "But I do have some concerns." Naomi turned to her, keeping her posture open, neutral. "Of course. I'd love to hear your thoughts." Jessica glanced at William before continuing, positioning herself carefully. "I worry that implementing something like this could create unintended consequences. Employees might start to feel like promotions and leadership roles are being decided based on diversity initiatives rather than performance. How do we ensure that we're not compromising meritocracy?" It was a classic argument, one Naomi had heard in countless boardrooms before. It was never phrased outright as a rejection of diversity efforts, it was always positioned as a concern for fairness, a cautionary tale of what might happen if the company went too far. She didn't react immediately. Instead, she let the question hang in the air for a moment before responding. "That's an important question," Naomi said, nodding. "And the answer is simple: we don't replace meritocracy. We strengthen it." Jessica raised an eyebrow but said nothing, so Naomi continued. "The truth is, true meritocracy doesn't exist unless every employee has equal access to opportunity. Right now, we know that networks and informal sponsorship often play a bigger role in promotions than actual performance. What this initiative does is level the playing field. It ensures that everyone has the same access to leadership opportunities, mentorship, and training. If anything, it removes bias and allows meritocracy to work as it was intended." Jessica tilted her head slightly. "But doesn't this put extra pressure on leadership to fill roles in a way that checks certain boxes?" Naomi resisted the urge to sigh. She could see what Jessica was doing, casting doubt, planting seeds of hesitation, trying to steer the conversation away from the progress they had made. Instead of getting defensive, Naomi simply smiled. "It puts pressure on leadership to recognize and cultivate the best talent, period. That benefits everyone. The numbers prove it." She clicked to a slide with retention data from other firms that had successfully implemented similar strategies. Companies that have embraced this approach haven't just improved diversity, they've improved performance across the board. Employees stay longer. Engagement increases. Innovation grows. And most importantly, leadership pipelines become stronger and more effective. Madeline nodded, clearly impressed, but Naomi could tell Jessica wasn't done. "That's helpful data," Jessica said, her tone measured, "but my other concern is practicality. How do we implement this without overburdening our teams? Managers already have full plates. Are we expecting them to take on additional responsibilities?" Naomi had been prepared for that one, too. Good leadership isn't about adding more work, it's about working smarter. This initiative is designed to be integrated into existing structures, not as an add-on, but as an enhancement. She turned to Madeline. "Think of it like refining a process, not creating an entirely new one. We already have employee training programs in place, leadership meetings, performance evaluations. This initiative weaves into those seamlessly, helping managers become better leaders in the process." Jessica's expression remained unreadable, but Naomi knew she had successfully countered every single one of her objections. She also knew Jessica wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Naomi could feel the tension in the room shift as she finished answering Jessica's questions. Some of the executives were leaning forward now, engaged, intrigued. Jessica had tried to poke holes in her proposal, but Naomi had been ready for every single question. She wasn't just defending her ideas, she was proving their value, showing the executives in the room that this wasn't just another corporate initiative doomed to sit in a report on someone's desk. This was a strategy that worked. William Donovan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I have to say, Naomi, I like the way you're approaching this. It's data-driven, it's realistic, and, most importantly, it's actionable. You're not just telling us what needs to change, you're showing us how to do it." Naomi gave a small nod. "That's the goal. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it also doesn't happen by accident. It has to be intentional, structured, and led from the top." Across the table, Madeline Brooks was already flipping through the printed proposal Naomi had provided. "I especially like the idea of integrating these strategies into existing leadership development programs," she said. "If we do this right, we're not just making improvements for one group of employees, we're improving our management culture as a whole." "That's exactly right," Naomi agreed. "Stronger leadership benefits everyone. It's not just about diversity, it's about building a better company." Frederick Harris, the board member who had been quiet for most of the exchange, finally spoke again. "I've sat in a lot of these presentations," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Most of the time, I hear big ideas with no clear plan to execute them. But this is different." He looked directly at Naomi. I appreciate that you're coming in here not just with theories, but with real, measurable steps to make this work. Naomi could feel it now, the shift. She had allies in the room. Jessica might have tried to resist, but she was outnumbered. The most influential decision makers, the CEO, the COO, and a key board member, were all nodding, all engaged. And in corporate America, that meant she was winning. Naomi stepped into the quiet, warmly lit cafe, scanning the room until she spotted Ethan seated at a small table by the window. He was dressed casually in a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a stark contrast to the structured business attire he had worn on the flight. His face broke into a smile when he saw her. "Naomi Carter," he said, standing as she approached. "Still making waves in corporate America, I see." She laughed, shaking his extended hand before sliding into the seat across from him. "Something like that. And you, Mr. Green? Still fighting the good fight in HR?" He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Trying to, at least. Some days, it feels like an uphill battle. Other days, I see real change happening." A server arrived, and Naomi ordered an Americano before settling in. It had been a long morning at Sterling Financial, and she needed the caffeine. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "So, tell me, how was the big pitch?" She exhaled, shaking her head with a tired but satisfied smile. "It went well. Better than I expected, actually. The CEO, the COO, and a key board member were all engaged. I think they're seriously considering moving forward." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And the catch?" Naomi smirked. He had always been quick to pick up on things. "Jessica Reynolds." Ethan let out a low whistle. "She's at Sterling?" "Oh, she's not just at Sterling," Naomi said, stirring her coffee absently. "She's their head of talent acquisition. And she was on my flight yesterday." Ethan's brow furrowed. "That sounds complicated." Naomi let out a dry chuckle. "That's one way to put it. Let's just say she and I didn't exactly have the best first interaction. And she made sure to push back in the meeting today." Ethan nodded knowingly. "That tracks. I've been in HR long enough to recognize the type. The ones who say they support diversity, just as long as it doesn't require them to change anything." Naomi sighed. "Exactly. And she's good at it. Not outright resistance, nothing she'd ever get called out for, just these subtle little doubts she plants. But I handled it." Ethan studied her for a moment, then smiled. "Of course, you did. You've always been good at navigating people like that." Naomi smiled back, feeling a familiar warmth settle between them. The easy conversation, the shared understanding, it was refreshing, like taking off uncomfortable shoes at the end of a long day. And for the first time in hours, she felt like she could breathe. Naomi took a slow sip of her coffee, savoring the rich, slightly bitter warmth. Across the table, Ethan was watching her with a quiet curiosity, the kind of gaze that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. "You ever think about it?" he asked, setting his mug down. She arched a brow. "Think about what?" He smiled, tilting his head slightly. "How we keep finding each other in these spaces. The conferences, the boardrooms, now this. It's like no matter where we go, we always seem to end up crossing paths." Naomi let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "I think that just means corporate America still doesn't have enough of us in these spaces." Ethan nodded. "Maybe. But I'd like to believe there's more to it than that." There was something in his voice, something gentle but certain, that made Naomi pause. She had known Ethan for years, first as a colleague, then as a friend. Their careers had taken them in different directions, yet somehow, they kept finding each other again, like two people navigating the same storm, but always managing to meet at the same safe harbor. She glanced out the cafe window. The late afternoon light filtered in through the glass, casting a golden glow over Ethan's face. He looked comfortable, familiar, and yet different. She hadn't thought about him this way in years, not since their early days working in the same firm, grabbing late-night takeout after long meetings, laughing over inside jokes only they understood. Back then, she had brushed off the possibility of anything more. Timing. Priorities. Life always seemed to get in the way. But now, sitting here with him, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had been too quick to dismiss the idea. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. You've always had this ability to keep moving forward, no matter what's in your way. I've always admired that about you. Naomi felt warmth rise in her chest, unexpected but not unwelcome. That's funny, she said, smiling. Because I've always admired how you never let people forget their worth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the cafe faded, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Then, Ethan exhaled, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his lips. So, what are the odds we both end up in Chicago for a few more days? Naomi met his gaze, her heart beating just a little faster than before. Better than you might think. Naomi swirled her coffee in slow circles, watching the liquid shift but not really seeing it. The warmth of the cafe, the quiet murmur of conversation around them, it all faded as she considered Ethan's words. I think about it a lot, she admitted, finally looking up. How we work twice as hard to be seen as competent. How we carry the weight of being the only one in the room, over and over again. Ethan exhaled, nodding. Yeah. And the worst part? Half the time, people don't even realize the pressure we're under. They think we're being overly sensitive if we bring it up. Naomi gave a knowing smirk. Oh, I've heard them all. You're so articulate. You're so polished. Like they expected anything less. Ethan chuckled, but there was no real humor in it. Or my personal favorite, you're not like the others. Naomi shook her head. As if that's a compliment. There was a shared understanding between them, one built on years of navigating workplaces where they were expected to be exceptional just to be considered equal. It was a balancing act, being confident but not intimidating, being ambitious but not aggressive, being direct but not difficult. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You know what still gets me? How companies act like diversity is some new experiment. Like we're some kind of initiative they need to try out instead of recognizing that we've always been here. We've always been qualified. Naomi nodded, resting her chin on her hand. And then there's the unspoken rules. The way you learn to navigate office politics. The way you have to be mindful of every reaction. It's exhausting. Ethan steadied her, his expression softer now. But you still keep pushing forward. So do you? He smiled slightly, shaking his head. We don't really have a choice, do we? Naomi thought about that for a moment. Maybe once, she would have agreed without hesitation. But now, sitting here, feeling the depth of their shared experiences, she wondered if the truth was something more. Maybe we do, she said finally. Maybe we get to decide how we move forward. How we use the spaces we've earned to make it better for the next ones coming up behind us. Ethan's gaze lingered on her, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he nodded, raising his cup slightly. Now that's something worth toasting to. Naomi clinked her coffee mug lightly against his, a small but meaningful moment between two people who understood the road they had traveled and the responsibility of making it smoother for those who would follow. Naomi adjusted her blazer as she stepped into the private office on the 47th floor of Sterling Financial's headquarters. The view of downtown Chicago stretched wide behind Madeline Brooks, who stood at the window, hands clasped behind her back. The mid-afternoon sun cast sharp lines across the executive's desk, but Madeline's expression was softer than Naomi expected when she turned to greet her. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me privately, Madeline said, motioning to the leather chair across from her desk. After this morning's presentation, I thought we should talk. Naomi sat, crossing one leg over the other, careful to maintain a poised, confident demeanor. Of course. I appreciate the opportunity. Madeline gave her a thoughtful look before sitting down as well. You did well in that room. William and Frederick were clearly engaged, and I don't say this lightly, but I think you're exactly what Sterling needs right now. Naomi nodded, waiting. There was always a but. Madeline sighed, leaning back slightly. That said, you should know that not everyone is going to be as enthusiastic about your proposal. Naomi wasn't surprised. Jessica. Madeline gave a small, knowing smile. I see you've already picked up on that. Naomi rested her hands in her lap. She was challenging me throughout the meeting, though she kept it subtle. I take it she's not just playing devil's advocate. Madeline tapped a manicured nail on her desk. Jessica is good at what she does, and she's been with Sterling for nearly a decade. She built her reputation on steady, incremental improvements, nothing too disruptive, nothing that shakes the status quo too much. Your approach is different. Different, Naomi repeated, carefully neutral. Madeline's lips curved slightly. Let's just say your strategy is more ambitious than what she's used to. And ambitious means risk. Naomi held back a sigh. This was familiar territory, executives who supported change in theory but got nervous when it required real structural shifts. She doesn't have the power to reject the proposal outright, does she? Naomi asked. Madeline shook her head. No, but she has influence. She controls the hiring pipeline and has deep relationships with department heads. If she wanted to slow things down or make implementation difficult, she could. Naomi absorbed that. And what about you? She asked, tilting her head slightly. Where do you stand? Madeline met her gaze, unwavering. I stand with results. If your plan works, I'll back you every step of the way. Naomi considered that answer. It was diplomatic, but it wasn't a dismissal. It told her that Madeline was an ally, but only if Naomi proved her worth. That wasn't discouraging, though. Naomi was used to proving herself. Then let's talk strategy, Naomi said, leaning forward. If Jessica is going to be a roadblock, I'd rather not spend the next 6 months fighting her at every turn. What's the best way to bring her in instead of making her feel pushed out? A glint of interest sparked in Madeline's eyes. You're thinking of giving her a stake in the process. Naomi nodded. I need her to feel like she has something to gain, not something to lose. Madeline steadied her for a moment before nodding. That's smart. Let me think on that. I might have a few ideas. Naomi exhaled, feeling the gears start to turn. This wasn't just a business pitch anymore, it was politics. And if she wanted to win, she needed to play the game wisely. Naomi stepped out of Madeline's office and into the hushed executive corridor, her mind already racing through the possibilities. If Jessica Reynolds wanted to be a roadblock, Naomi had two choices: fight against her or find a way to make her an ally. She took the elevator down to the lobby, then decided to take a walk before heading back to her hotel. The crisp Chicago air helped her think. This wasn't her first time dealing with resistance. She had spent years navigating corporate spaces where change was welcomed with smiles but resisted behind closed doors. Jessica wasn't just a random opponent. She was a seasoned executive who had carved out her own place at Sterling Financial. That meant she wouldn't take kindly to being sidelined. If Naomi pushed too hard, Jessica would push back twice as hard. But if she could find a way to give Jessica ownership over part of the initiative, she might shift her from an obstacle to a collaborator. The challenge was figuring out what Jessica wanted. Naomi ducked into a coffee shop, ordered a tea, and pulled out her notebook. She jotted down everything she knew about Jessica so far. Jessica valued control. Jessica had built her reputation on slow, careful progress. Jessica didn't outright oppose diversity efforts, but she resisted big, disruptive changes. Jessica had tenure and influence, but was careful about how she used it. That meant she wasn't the type to publicly sabotage a company initiative, but she could quietly make things difficult. Naomi tapped her pen against the page, then underlined one word: mentorship. If Jessica saw herself as a gatekeeper, then maybe the best way to align their interests was to position her as a leader in the process instead of someone forced to follow. Naomi's mind started connecting the dots. She could propose that Jessica co-lead the new mentorship program, a key part of the initiative that was designed to help retain mid-career employees by pairing them with senior leaders. It was an area that played to Jessica's strengths: HR, career development, professional coaching. If Jessica accepted, it would give her a stake in the program's success. And if she rejected the role, that refusal would send a message to the rest of the leadership team. Naomi allowed herself a small smile as she sipped her tea. If this was a game of corporate chess, she had just planned her next move. Naomi knew that shifting power dynamics in a corporate environment wasn't about forcing change overnight. It was about strategic influence, small but deliberate moves that reshaped the landscape before anyone could resist outright. If she wanted Jessica to engage with her initiative rather than work against it, she needed to make sure Jessica saw involvement as a benefit, not a concession. She started by planting the first seed. Later that afternoon, she sent an email to Jessica, keeping the tone professional but inviting. Jessica, I appreciated your insights during this morning's meeting. Given your experience leading talent acquisition, I'd love to hear more of your perspective on how we can ensure a smooth rollout of the mentorship component of the initiative. I believe your expertise in this area would be invaluable. Would you be open to a one-on-one conversation? I'd love to explore how we can align our efforts for maximum impact. Best, Naomi. Naomi crafted the message carefully. There was no demand, no push, just an open door. It framed Jessica's expertise as critical while giving her an opportunity to step forward without losing face. The next step was rallying allies. Before leaving for the day, she stopped by Madeline's office. I reached out to Jessica, she said, keeping her tone neutral. I'd like to bring her in on the mentorship piece of the initiative. I think if she has a leadership role, she'll be more invested. Madeline studied her for a long moment, then smiled slightly. That's smart. Jessica likes to feel like she's steering the ship. If she thinks this is something she's shaping rather than something being imposed, she might come around. Naomi nodded. That was exactly the plan. Later that evening, she received a short but telling reply from Jessica. Let's discuss. I have availability tomorrow at 3 p.m. It wasn't an enthusiastic yes, but it wasn't a no either. Naomi knew this was just the beginning of the power shift. She wasn't just implementing a new program, she was changing the way influence worked inside Sterling Financial. The night air was crisp as Naomi stepped out of the car, the soft glow of city lights reflecting off the grand entrance of the Sterling Financial Charity Gala. The event was being held at the Chicago Cultural Center, an opulent landmark with towering marble columns and breathtaking stained glass domes. The moment she stepped onto the red-carpeted walkway leading inside, she felt the shift in atmosphere, the hum of wealth and power, the subtle currents of influence that flowed beneath polite conversation. She glanced over at Ethan, who had stepped out behind her, adjusting the sleeves of his tailored black tuxedo. He looked effortlessly polished, but when he caught her gaze, he gave a small, almost amused smile. "You clean up well," she said, letting a bit of warmth slip into her voice. "So do you," he replied, his eyes traveling over her deep blue evening gown. The fabric shimmered under the chandeliers, elegant yet understated, exactly the balance she had hoped to strike for an event like this. A valet opened the doors for them, and they stepped inside. The grand rotunda was alive with movement. Men in sleek black suits, women in glittering gowns, the air filled with laughter, the soft clink of champagne glasses, and the polished notes of a live jazz ensemble playing in the background. Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice low. "Remind me again, is this a party or a corporate battlefield in disguise?" Naomi smirked. "Both. Be ready for anything." They moved through the room, exchanging polite nods with familiar faces. Naomi spotted William Donovan and Madeline Brooks deep in conversation with a group of high-level donors, while board member Frederick Harris stood near the silent auction table, chatting with a well-dressed couple. Then, across the room, Naomi caught sight of Jessica Reynolds. Dressed in a sleek red gown, Jessica stood near the main bar, effortlessly holding court among a small group of executives. She was smiling, laughing at something, but when her eyes flickered toward Naomi and Ethan, there was the briefest hesitation, a moment of recognition, a small but telling shift in her expression. Naomi didn't react. Not yet. Tonight wasn't about old tensions, it was about strategy. Ethan, sensing the moment, smoothly changed the subject. So what's the actual charity focus tonight? Education programs for underprivileged youth, Naomi said, scanning the room. It's one of Sterling's more legitimate philanthropic efforts. The board takes it seriously. Ethan nodded. And let me guess, the real reason for the event is networking? She smiled. Always. A server passed by, offering them champagne. Naomi took a glass, but only held it lightly between her fingers. She needed a clear head tonight. Ethan took a sip from his and glanced at her. So, what's the game plan? Naomi exhaled slowly. Make connections, build trust. And keep an eye on Jessica. She's too smart to make an obvious move tonight, but she won't ignore me either. Ethan nodded, following her lead as they stepped further into the swirling currents of the gala. Naomi knew that tonight wasn't just about charity, it was about power. And she was ready to play the game. Naomi moved through the glittering crowd, her gaze steady, her posture poised. The Sterling Financial Charity Gala was more than just a high-profile event, it was an opportunity, a stage where influence could be quietly exchanged behind polite conversation and raised champagne glasses. She knew exactly who she needed to speak with tonight, and at the top of that list was Frederick Harris. Frederick was not only a respected board member, but he was also one of the strongest voices advocating for real change within the company. His support could make the difference between her diversity initiative being fully embraced or getting buried under corporate red tape. She spotted him near the silent auction table, engaged in conversation with a man Naomi recognized as a major donor. Frederick, in his early 60s, carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the highest levels of corporate America. He was a rare figure, a man with power who actually wanted to use it to make a difference. Ethan, sensing her focus, leaned in slightly. You want me to introduce myself first, give you an opening? Naomi smiled, appreciating his instinct. I think I've got this one. She waited for the right moment, then smoothly stepped forward as the donor excused himself. Mr. Harris, she greeted warmly. Frederick turned, his expression shifting from mild surprise to recognition. Naomi Carter. I was hoping I'd get a chance to speak with you tonight. She extended her hand, which he shook firmly. That's good to hear. I appreciate the engagement you showed during the presentation. He chuckled, gesturing toward a nearby cocktail table. That was one of the strongest proposals I've seen in a long time. Let's sit for a minute. Naomi followed him, subtly aware that other executives were noticing their conversation. That was a good thing. Power moved in whispers, and who was seen talking to whom? Frederick rested his glass on the table and leaned in slightly. I've been pushing for a real diversity initiative at Sterling for years. But you and I both know these things don't happen overnight. Naomi nodded. No, they don't. That's why my strategy focuses on integration, making DEI efforts part of the structure, not an extra program that leadership can quietly ignore when priorities shift. Frederick studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. That's the right approach. Too many companies treat diversity like a marketing strategy instead of a leadership one. And that's why we end up losing good talent. Naomi felt encouraged by his words. Exactly. But I know there's resistance. Frederick sighed, shaking his head. There always is. Some people don't like the idea of change, even when it benefits them. And in this case, you're disrupting an entire power structure that some have spent years benefiting from. Naomi met his gaze, reading between the lines. Jessica. He exhaled, taking a sip of his drink before answering. She's influential. She's careful. She won't block you outright, but she knows how to slow things down, create doubt, turn key people against it just enough that momentum fades. Naomi let that settle before responding. That's why I reached out to her. I want to bring her into the process rather than force her to react to it. Frederick's eyebrows lifted slightly. Then, a slow smile spread across his face. Smart. Very smart. She took a sip of her champagne, feeling the subtle but significant weight of approval in his tone. I have a feeling you're going to do well here, Naomi, Frederick said. And if you ever need an ally, you know where to find me. Naomi smiled, feeling the shift in her favor. Tonight was turning out to be exactly the opportunity she needed. As Naomi finished her conversation with Frederick, she could feel the quiet satisfaction of progress. His support was a powerful asset, one that could help shift the balance of influence within Sterling Financial. But just as she was taking a breath, she felt another presence approaching. Jessica Reynolds. Naomi turned, watching as Jessica strode toward her with the effortless confidence of someone who had played this game for years. Dressed in a sleek, crimson gown, she looked every bit the polished executive, her expression pleasant, but Naomi knew better. There was something calculated in the way she moved, the way her gaze flickered toward Frederick before settling on Naomi. Naomi, Jessica said smoothly, holding a flute of champagne as though they were merely two colleagues enjoying a light conversation. I see you've been busy tonight. Naomi smiled, matching her tone. It's been a great opportunity to connect. Jessica's lips curved in something resembling a smile, but Naomi caught the faintest edge of something else, control, or the attempt to reclaim it. I was just speaking with a few department heads, Jessica said, her voice casual, as if she wasn't about to test Naomi's footing. There's been some concern about how disruptive a full-scale diversity initiative could be. Some are wondering whether we should start with a smaller pilot program before committing too many resources. Naomi's grip on her glass tightened just slightly, though she didn't let it show. Jessica was doing exactly what Frederick had warned her about, creating doubt, slowing things down. Naomi kept her expression composed. I completely understand concerns about implementation. That's why my strategy is built for integration, not disruption. Jessica took a sip of her champagne, tilting her head slightly. Even so, I imagine leadership will want to take a more measured approach. We wouldn't want to rush into something that could cause unnecessary tension within the organization. There it was, the subtle positioning. Jessica wasn't outright rejecting Naomi's initiative, but she was planting the seed that it needed to be slowed down, reevaluated, reduced. Naomi refused to take the bait. That's why buy-in is so important, she said evenly. When leadership is engaged and invested, these initiatives don't feel like a disruption, they feel like a natural evolution. Jessica studied her for a beat longer, as if assessing her next move. Then, she smiled again, this time with just the faintest trace of challenge. Well, we'll have to see how things unfold, Jessica said, lifting her glass in a small, deliberate toast. Naomi returned the gesture, meeting Jessica's eyes without wavering. She had expected resistance. Now, she knew exactly where it was coming from. Naomi held Jessica's gaze, refusing to let the moment tilt in the other woman's favor. Jessica had made her move, planting seeds of doubt, nudging the conversation toward caution and hesitation. But Naomi had spent too many years in boardrooms where the slightest hesitation could derail an entire initiative. She wasn't going to let that happen tonight. She smiled, calm and assured, and took a measured sip of her champagne before responding. You know, Jessica, I actually think we're in agreement. Jessica's expression didn't shift, but Naomi caught the faint flicker of surprise in her eyes. We both want what's best for Sterling Financial, Naomi continued smoothly. I completely understand the need for a thoughtful approach. After all, real change isn't about pushing too fast, but about creating something that lasts. That's why my framework is built for long-term success, not just a quick rollout that checks a box. She let the words sink in before adding, that's also why leadership engagement is key. When executives set the tone, it creates a ripple effect. Employees don't feel like they're being forced into change, they feel like they're part of it. From the corner of her eye, Naomi saw Madeline Brooks step closer, catching the tail end of the exchange. William Donovan wasn't far behind, his gaze flicking between them, clearly observing. Perfect timing. Jessica kept her pleasant smile, but Naomi could sense the shift. The conversation wasn't going in the direction Jessica had planned. Before Jessica could speak, Frederick Harris, who had also been within earshot, let out a low chuckle. Now that's what I like to hear. A plan that actually leads somewhere. William, now fully engaged, gave Naomi a nod. That's exactly what we need here, practical execution. I'd like to discuss it further next week. Jessica's grip on her champagne glass tightened slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. Naomi had just turned Jessica's attempt to slow things down into an opportunity to speed them up. She smiled, tilting her head slightly. I'd be happy to set that up. The game was shifting in her favor. The morning after the gala, Naomi arrived at Sterling Financial's headquarters prepared to follow up on the momentum she had built. She knew the event had put her in a strong position. Frederick Harris had openly supported her, William Donovan had requested a follow-up discussion, and Madeline Brooks had been listening closely. But she also knew Jessica Reynolds wouldn't sit back and accept defeat. And by mid-morning, her instincts were confirmed. Naomi's assistant forwarded an internal memo, one that had Jessica's fingerprints all over it. The email, sent to William, Madeline, and key department heads, was carefully worded, but Naomi could see exactly what Jessica was doing. Given the complexity of implementing a company-wide initiative of this scale, I propose that we take additional time to conduct a thorough internal assessment before committing to a rollout schedule. While Naomi Carter's recommendations are promising, we must ensure that we are aligned with existing priorities and have buy-in from all levels of leadership before making significant structural changes. It was subtle, but the intent was clear: stall the process, create delays, cast just enough doubt to make leadership hesitate. Naomi took a deep breath, rolling her shoulders back. This was exactly the kind of passive resistance that slowed down progress in corporations. No outright refusal, no dramatic opposition, just a slow, steady stream of bureaucratic roadblocks meant to wear down enthusiasm until the initiative lost momentum. She tapped out a reply, carefully balancing professionalism with precision. Jessica, I appreciate your thorough approach to implementation, and I agree that strategic alignment is critical. However, we've already conducted an internal assessment through our listening sessions, and the data shows that employees are ready for these changes. I'd be happy to discuss any specific concerns you may have, but based on our leadership conversations, including William's request for next steps, I believe we're in a strong position to move forward on schedule. She CC'd William, Madeline, and Frederick before pressing send. If Jessica wanted to stall, Naomi was going to make sure leadership saw her for exactly what she was doing. Not 10 minutes later, Naomi's phone buzzed. Jessica. Naomi smoothed out her expression before answering. Jessica, good morning. Jessica's voice was as polished as ever. Naomi, I just wanted to touch base on the timeline. I think we need to be realistic about the scope here. Change management takes time, and I don't want to rush something that could lead to resistance internally. Naomi leaned back in her chair. I completely agree that change management is important, which is why we've already factored that into the strategy. The phased rollout ensures teams have time to adapt, and by engaging leadership early, we mitigate resistance. Jessica didn't pause, pressing forward. Even so, I think leadership will want more time to assess. It's not about resistance, it's about making sure this is done correctly. Naomi recognized the classic tactic, framed the delay as being in everyone's best interest while subtly reinforcing the idea that moving forward now was risky. She wasn't falling for it. I understand, Naomi said evenly. That's why I've scheduled follow-ups with leadership to confirm the next steps. But based on our conversations at the gala, the support is there. We should take advantage of that momentum. Jessica went quiet for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Naomi to know she had made her point. Finally, Jessica sighed lightly. Let's discuss this further at the leadership meeting tomorrow. Naomi smiled to herself. Looking forward to it. Jessica was still trying to control the timeline, but Naomi wasn't letting her dictate the pace. This wasn't just a battle over an initiative, it was a battle over who truly held influence. The next morning, Naomi walked into Sterling Financial's executive conference room with a quiet but unshakable confidence. She knew the dynamics in play. Jessica had spent the last 24 hours trying to slow down her initiative, subtly casting doubt under the guise of caution. But Naomi had anticipated this, and more importantly, she had allies in the right places. As she settled into her chair, she saw Jessica already seated, her expression composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Across from them, William Donovan, Madeline Brooks, and Frederick Harris were in attendance, the three most influential decision-makers in the company. William leaned back slightly in his chair, setting down the executive summary Naomi had provided. "All right," he said, his tone even. "Let's talk next steps." Jessica cleared her throat, keeping her voice smooth and measured. "I think before we move too quickly, we need to ensure alignment. There are still concerns about implementation, and I believe it's worth revisiting whether a longer assessment phase would be beneficial." Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Madeline spoke before she had the chance. "Jessica, we've already discussed this. The feedback we gathered internally showed clear support for moving forward." Jessica's polite smile didn't waver. "I understand, but I've also spoken with several department heads who still have questions. If we proceed too quickly, we risk losing their buy-in." Naomi kept her posture relaxed but firm. Buy-in comes from involvement, not delays. That's why I've built the initiative to engage key leadership figures in the process. If we keep pushing the timeline back, we risk losing momentum. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Frederick let out a small chuckle and leaned forward. "I have to say, Naomi makes a strong point," he said, folding his hands in front of him. "Every major change comes with hesitation, but we have a clear roadmap in place. Slowing it down at this stage doesn't strengthen the initiative, it weakens it." Jessica glanced at Frederick, her lips pressing together for a fraction of a second before she recovered. William, who had been listening intently, nodded. "I agree. We've had plenty of discussions, and I see no reason to stall. Let's move forward as planned." Naomi met Jessica's gaze and saw the shift. Jessica wasn't in control of the decision anymore. She had tried to delay, but the most powerful figures in the room had made it clear Naomi's initiative was moving forward. Naomi could see it, the subtle tension in Jessica's posture, the barely perceptible flicker in her gaze as her attempts to stall were met with resistance from the very leadership she had hoped to sway. Jessica wasn't used to losing control of the narrative. But Naomi also knew this wasn't over. If she pushed too hard now, she'd risk making Jessica more combative. If she gloated in victory, she'd turn an opponent into an enemy. No, this required something else: strategy, patience, and a touch of diplomacy. She leaned forward slightly, keeping her expression composed. "Jessica, I completely understand the concerns you're raising. Implementation is always the most delicate part of an initiative like this, and I value your expertise in this space. That's why I'd like to work with you directly on making sure leadership engagement is as strong as possible." Jessica blinked, her expression unreadable. Naomi could tell she hadn't expected an invitation into the process. Madeline raised a brow, intrigued, while Frederick watched with his usual quiet amusement. William gave an approving nod. "That's a smart approach. We need all hands on deck for this to work." Jessica hesitated, and for the first time, Naomi saw the calculation shift. Jessica was faced with a choice: continue resisting and risk looking like the only holdout, or take Naomi's offer and maintain her influence in a way that still gave her power. Finally, she gave a slow, measured nod. "I'd be open to discussing how we structure that collaboration." Naomi smiled. "Great. I'll set up some time for us to go through next steps." The conversation moved on, but Naomi knew she had just won something bigger than Jessica's agreement. She had changed the dynamic. Instead of Jessica controlling the terms, Naomi had positioned herself as the one making the offer, setting the pace. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about making sure that when the initiative moved forward, it was on Naomi's terms. And now, it would be. Naomi sat at the long mahogany table in Sterling Financial's executive boardroom, her fingers lightly resting on her notepad. This was it. The final meeting to determine whether her diversity initiative would be fully approved and integrated into the company's structure. The atmosphere in the room was charged, not with tension, but with anticipation. William Donovan sat at the head of the table, reviewing the last of the reports. Madeline Brooks was beside him, arms crossed, her expression thoughtful but engaged. Frederick Harris sat further down, leaning back with his usual air of quiet confidence. And then there was Jessica. She had played her role well in the past few weeks, no longer outright resisting, but not exactly championing the initiative either. Naomi had given her room to save face, inviting her into the process, ensuring she had a say. It had worked. Jessica was no longer an obstacle, but she wasn't an ally yet. That was fine. Naomi didn't need her to be. She just needed the approval. William set his pen down and exhaled, tapping the edge of the report in front of him. "Well," he said, glancing around the room. "I think we've all had time to review Naomi's framework, and I've spoken with several department heads who are optimistic about the phased rollout. I don't see any reason to hold this up any longer." Naomi kept her face neutral, though a slow, steady pulse of victory thrummed inside her. Frederick nodded. "Agreed. I've been in this business for decades, and I've seen more than my fair share of corporate initiatives that were all talk and no action. This isn't one of them. This is smart, it's strategic, and more importantly, it's necessary." Madeline sat forward, lacing her fingers together. "I also want to acknowledge how well Naomi has navigated this process. We all know organizational change isn't easy, but she's shown the kind of leadership that makes execution possible." Naomi inclined her head, accepting the praise with quiet gratitude. Then, all eyes turned to Jessica. She didn't rush to speak. Instead, she flipped through a few pages of the report, as if considering her words carefully. Naomi knew this was a performance, but it didn't matter. Finally, Jessica looked up and nodded. "I think this initiative is positioned well for success. If leadership is aligned, then I'm confident we can move forward." A subtle shift happened in the room. Jessica wasn't just conceding, she was attaching herself to the win. William smiled, satisfied. "Then it's decided. We move forward with implementation." Naomi exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment sink in. This was more than just a professional victory. This was proof that persistence, strategy, and patience could overcome even the most subtle resistance. She had done it. And now, the real work would begin. Naomi barely had time to set her tea down before her phone buzzed beside her. She glanced at the screen, and a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Ethan. Still awake?" She hesitated for only a moment before typing back. "Barely. Long day." His reply came almost instantly. "You deserve a celebration. What's your hotel bar like?" Naomi let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. Of course, he would say that. She could practically hear his voice, that easy confidence, that natural way he had of making things feel lighter. Quiet, classy. No neon signs, if that's what you're asking. Perfect. Meet me there in 10? She stared at the message, feeling something shift in the air between them. This wasn't just about a drink. It wasn't even just about celebrating. There was something else between them, something unspoken yet undeniably present. It had been simmering beneath the surface since they first reconnected. Maybe even longer than that. She took a breath, then typed her reply. "See you there." A few minutes later, she stepped into the dimly lit bar, the warm glow of soft amber lights casting long shadows over the sleek leather booths. Ethan was already there, leaning casually against the bar, two glasses in front of him. He looked up when he saw her, that familiar, easy grin appearing as if it had been waiting just for her. "I took a chance and ordered for you," he said as she approached. Naomi raised an eyebrow as she slid onto the stool next to him. "What if you got it wrong?" His grin widened. "Then I would have ordered another." She picked up the glass and took a slow sip, the warmth of the whiskey spreading through her. Smooth, rich, just what she needed. She exhaled, setting the glass down. "You did it," Ethan said after a moment, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. Naomi traced her fingers along the rim of her glass. "Yeah, I did." She hadn't fully let herself feel it yet, the weight of everything that had happened, the battle she had fought, the victory she had won. She had been too focused on what came next, too caught up in the constant movement of corporate life. But now, in this quiet moment, it was settling in. Ethan leaned in slightly, watching her closely. "I've seen you in work mode for years, but this? Watching you handle Jessica, steer the conversation, hold your ground," he shook his head, a slow smile forming. "It was something else." Naomi smirked. "You mean I was terrifying?" He chuckled. "No. You were brilliant." There was something in the way he said it, something in the way his eyes held hers. The noise of the bar faded, the world outside disappeared, and for the first time, Naomi let herself acknowledge it. The shift. The possibility. The way this connection had always been there, waiting for the right moment. Maybe, just maybe, that moment had finally come. Naomi sat by the window of her hotel room, gazing out at the vast stretch of city lights shimmering against the night sky. The hum of Chicago traffic echoed faintly below, a distant reminder that the world kept moving, no matter how much had changed in the span of a few days. She wrapped her hands around her tea, the warmth steadying her as she let herself, for the first time, truly take in everything that had happened. This trip had started as just another business pitch, another opportunity to do what she did best, build, persuade, and implement change. But now, looking back, she could see it had been so much more than that. She had faced opposition in ways she hadn't expected, not just in the boardroom, but in the quiet, subtle ways bias and power played out in corporate spaces. Jessica hadn't stormed into meetings and blocked Naomi outright. She hadn't refused to engage. Instead, she had done what so many people in positions of influence did when they felt control slipping away. She had slowed things down, raised just enough doubt, made things just difficult enough that progress could be delayed indefinitely. It wasn't the kind of resistance that made headlines. It was the kind that left ambitious, talented people exhausted, questioning whether the fight was worth it. The kind that caused initiatives like hers to stall until they were forgotten. But this time, Naomi hadn't let that happen. She had navigated it. Not by fighting Jessica head-on, but by shifting the game entirely, turning resistance into involvement, making it harder for Jessica to block the initiative without exposing herself. Naomi had learned that sometimes winning wasn't about defeating your opponent. It was about outmaneuvering them. And then there was Frederick, Madeline, and William, the leaders who had recognized what was at stake and used their influence to push progress forward. That was another lesson. Bias wasn't just about who stood in your way. It was also about who stood beside you, willing to challenge the status quo. She exhaled, letting the weight of the experience settle in her chest. There was power in standing firm, in choosing not to shrink. And now, she knew with even greater certainty that she belonged in these rooms, not as an outsider fighting to be heard, but as a force shaping the conversation. The world didn't change overnight. But step by step, conversation by conversation, strategy by strategy, it could change. And Naomi was determined to be part of that change. Naomi leaned back against the armrest of the plush hotel chair, letting her eyes drift over the skyline. The battle she had just fought, and won, hadn't been one of dramatic showdowns or explosive confrontations. It had been one of strategy, patience, and quiet but unwavering resilience. She thought back to every moment where she could have backed down. The tension on the plane. The silent battle with Jessica. The carefully laid roadblocks that had threatened to stall her initiative. At any point, she could have stepped aside, let the resistance take over, let things run their usual course. But she hadn't. Instead, she had chosen to meet resistance with strategy, to counter doubt with evidence, and to shift the dynamics instead of fighting them head-on. She had learned that corporate power wasn't always about who spoke the loudest or who had been in the room the longest. Sometimes, it was about who understood the game well enough to change the rules. Jessica had tried to slow the process, to create hesitation where none was needed. But Naomi had made it impossible for hesitation to take root. She had built relationships with the right people: William, Madeline, Frederick, leaders who saw the bigger picture and were willing to push forward. And even Jessica, for all her resistance, had been forced to adjust when Naomi refused to give her an easy way out. By offering her involvement instead of opposition, Naomi had left Jessica with two choices: join the movement or risk being the one seen as standing in its way. Naomi had spent years in rooms where she had to prove herself before she was truly heard. But this time, she hadn't just proved herself. She had changed the conversation. Resilience had kept her from shrinking. Strategy had ensured she moved forward anyway. And now, as she looked out over the city, she realized something else. This wasn't just a win for her. This was proof that power could be reshaped. Not by waiting for permission, but by taking a seat at the table and making it impossible to be ignored. Naomi sat in the stillness of her hotel room, her eyes tracing the city lights outside. The reflection of the skyline shimmered against the glass, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to exhale fully. The weight of everything, the battles fought, the obstacles maneuvered, the victory earned, was finally settling in. But as she sat there, she realized that success wasn't just about winning in the boardroom. The past few days had reminded her that even in the most high-stakes environments, even in the midst of power struggles and resistance, it wasn't just about the work. It was about the people. Ethan had been there, steady and unwavering. Their conversations, whether about corporate bias, resilience, or simply their own shared experiences, had become more than just professional exchanges. Somewhere along the way, something deeper had begun to take root. And as much as Naomi prided herself on her independence, on her ability to stand alone, she couldn't ignore how good it felt to have someone beside her who understood the weight she carried. Then there was Frederick, a reminder that true allies existed in spaces where she least expected them. He hadn't just supported her initiative, he had given her a seat at the table without hesitation, recognizing her value not as a box to check, but as someone capable of real, lasting change. And even Jessica, for all the challenges she had posed, had given Naomi something valuable, a lesson in power, in patience, and how influence worked beneath the surface. Naomi had spent so much of her career believing that success was measured in titles, deals closed, initiatives approved. But now, she could see it was also measured in the connections that shaped those victories. In the people who stood by you when the fight got hard. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling something unfamiliar but welcome settle inside her. For the first time in a long time, Naomi wasn't just thinking about the next battle, the next meeting, the next goal. She was thinking about who she wanted beside her as she moved forward. Naomi stood by the window, watching the city stretch before her, glowing with life and possibility. She had come to Chicago expecting to make a business deal, to navigate the usual corporate hurdles, and to leave with another win under her belt. But what she was taking home was so much more than that. This trip had tested her in ways she hadn't expected. It had reminded her that bias wasn't always loud, it was often quiet, embedded in the very structures she was trying to change. It had reinforced that power didn't always belong to those who spoke the loudest, but to those who knew how to listen, adapt, and move forward anyway. She had learned that resistance didn't mean failure. It meant progress was happening. The more people pushed back, the more proof there was that something real was shifting. And she had shifted it. But beyond the victory, beyond the strategic wins and corporate maneuvering, Naomi had found something else: possibility. She had spent years moving from one challenge to the next, always focused on the next step up, the next seat at the table. Now, she was thinking about something different. Not just about where she was going, but about who she wanted to walk beside her. Ethan's presence had surprised her, not because he was there, but because of what he had come to mean. The easy laughter, the late-night conversations, the way he had quietly believed in her before she even won the fight. He wasn't just part of this trip, he was becoming part of the bigger picture. She smiled to herself, feeling a rare sense of peace settle over her. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. She had stepped into this city alone, ready to face yet another battle. But she was leaving with more than just a victory. She was leaving with momentum, with connection, with the certainty that, no matter what came next, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Life often presents us with challenges that test not only our strength, but our patience and resilience. Sometimes, obstacles don't come as outright rejections, but as subtle resistance, moments where we are quietly told to wait, to compromise, or to step aside. True progress isn't always about fighting loudly, but about knowing when to stand firm and when to shift the conversation. One of the greatest lessons we can carry is that power is not just in position, but in persistence. Influence is built over time, through relationships, through understanding how to navigate difficult situations with grace. We don't always win by pushing harder. Sometimes, we win by inviting others into the process, by making it harder for them to ignore what is right. But success isn't just about career victories or overcoming challenges. It's also about the people who walk beside us, the ones who believe in us, who remind us that we don't have to carry everything alone. At any stage of life, the most meaningful achievements aren't just in what we accomplish, but in the connections we build along the way. Change is always possible. It happens step by step, conversation by conversation, and with the courage to keep moving forward.